This is COMM 225. The topic is that we're covering supply chain management. Now this topic has a lot of theory compared to other topics, so there's lots of theory. I always recommend a good reading of that chapter. I think it's chapter 11. It's always good to have a good reading of the chapter. There's a lot of theory in it. I'm going to go over the important terminology in the chapter and other things that I believe that are going to be very important for your quizzes and the final examination. So what's a supply chain? That's a good question to ask at the beginning of this lecture is what's a supply chain? Well, the supply chain is basically everywhere around you. There's every product that you're using or you have used is made by a supply of a chain of companies and partners and individuals that work together to make that product. So if you take it as an example, your car. A car is made by many different organizations working together and firms. So probably the brakes are made by some supplier, and the steering wheel is probably made by another supplier, and all of it comes together as one final product. And even in assembly, you might have more than one organization assembling the car. But so the supply chain is basically the chain of all the different entities or partners that work together to make a product. So here we have an example of a supply chain for seafood. So we're looking at seafood in this example. So the supply chain is quite big for seafood. So the front side of the supply chain is where the final product is sold. So you could have it maybe at consumers at home. You could have it at restaurants. So maybe a restaurant is offering seafood, or maybe large-scale buyers. But before that, before we get to the final stage, there are many different stages that the product goes through to become what it is at the end. So we have distribution, which is also part of the supply chain, which is basically taking the product from where it's manufactured. This is where probably the manufacturing or the preparation or where the value added activities are happening. And the distribution is basically taking the final product to the consumer. Now, if we go to the very back of the supply chain, very back of the supply chain, right here. So let's focus on this part, which is basically the raw material. So the wild capture of the fish, if there's fish farming, then maybe the fish farms. And that is basically the back end of the supply chain. Now, then you have the collection of these and maybe doing a little bit of value-added activities here and so on. So basically, the supply chain is all the different stages that a product goes through till it gets to the consumer. So another example of a supply chain is the Boeing supply chain. So the commercial airplane manufacturer, Boeing. So we see here each part of the airplane is made by a different supplier or even a supplier which is located in a different region in the world. And even if we look at, for example, this supplier that is in Japan that provides the wing, even that supplier has a chain of suppliers helping that supplier to make the wing. So we end up with a very complex supply chain, which is maybe 5 or 6 stages of suppliers, then maybe second tier suppliers, then maybe manufacturing here, and so on. So we get a big supply chain network that is basically responsible for making the Boeing airplane. So this is a better picture of the supply chain. So here we have this is for cars. So this is the supply chain for cars, automobiles. Now we have at the front of the supply chain, we have the dealerships. So we have the dealerships of the cars. In the middle, we have the assembly plant. So this is where the cars get assembled. And the back of the supply chain, we have the parts supplier, and sometimes even further, we have the raw materials. So we have the plastics and the metals that go into the car. This is where this is the very back of the supply. Now, the front side of the supply chain, we call that the forward part of the supply chain. So forward supply chain, and this is the back supply chain. So that's the back of the supply chain. This is the forward part of the supply chain. So material is going to be moving from left to right. So all because everything the parts from the supplier, they will move forward to other suppliers, and from suppliers to assembly plants, and then onto the dealership, while movement of information is happening in the reverse direction. And this is information coming from the front side of the supply chain. So the front side of the supply chain. And this is the front side of the supply chain is going to be closer to where the customer is, and they're going to be feeding the sales data and sales information to the back of the supply chain. So this is the front side of the supply chain, and this is the back side of the supply chain. So there are many needs in the supply chain, in supply chain management. So if you're a manager of the supply chain, there's obviously the need to basically improve operation, make operations faster, more cost efficient, and so on. Also, there is the challenge of just in time. We will not cover just in time in this course, but just in time means that operations are happening exactly when they are needed. So if the assembly plant needs a certain part for the car for the assembly in December, then they will get that part exactly in December. That's what just in time. So that's a challenge with a supply chain this big. They need to get material in and in exactly on time. So that's a challenge. And then the other challenge is TQM, total quality management. Because quality might suffer with a big supply chain like this because you don't have control over your suppliers. So your suppliers right here, you have no control over them. So how do you manage quality? So that's a challenge. One very important need in supply chain management is basically the need for outsourcing. If we go back in the early 20th century, a company, for example, like Ford, they used to own their whole supply chain. So everything in their supply chain for making cars they owned, including the farms that farmed cotton which went into the car seats of the car were actually owned by Ford. Now, obviously, that was the model back in the early 20th century, but ever since then, more companies are moving to outsource, selling some of their processes, some of their businesses to outside companies, and then these outside companies will act as suppliers. Now, there's a huge advantage, many advantages of having outsourcing, lower cost. Other companies could focus the mother company could focus on what they're good at, and they could rely on suppliers that would eventually also grow specialization in that part or that sub-assembly, and hence it becomes lower, so the cost gets lower. And also expertise and knowledge. Sometimes some of the parts that go into some products, companies don't have the expertise in or the knowledge, so they go and outsource it from elsewhere. Gain flexibility. This is very important. You know, when a company owns so much of the supply chain, they're less flexible. There's so much of their capital tied into facilities, buildings, raw material, and so on. Outsourcing release them from some of this overburden, and obviously capacity. When your capacity cannot meet demand, you could outsource and get others to make some of your products. Now, the biggest risk is the reduction in control over your product. So parts that go into your product, you no longer have control over them, which will eventually affect. So it goes without saying that the supply chain is more and more seeing a lot of global partners. So you could have a supply chain where some of your partners are in East Asia, then other partners might be in Australia, while other companies that supply you with some raw material might be in Europe, Southeast Asia, and so on. So you have so many places that are feeding parts that go into the product or raw material. So there's a need for supply chain management on the global. So the another need is the increase of e-commerce. Having global supply chain means that a lot of your transactions are going to be done via internet or via e-commerce. The fifth need, and probably one of the more important needs, is how to manage inventories. Now, the problem with inventory ties a lot of your capital, and in supply chain, and especially with big companies, especially we see this in the automobile industry, companies such as Toyota, Honda, Ford, they all want to manage their inventories. They don't want to keep a lot of inventories. They want to reduce the amount of inventory because if they cannot sell the cars in the year they're made, then they have to probably sell them at a discounted value. I mean, inventory is a major headache for many companies. There's something called the bullwhip effect, which is an important term. And the bullwhip effect says even if let's say you get your forecast correct and you build your production based on that forecast, but there's small fluctuation on the front side of the supply chain. So maybe there is very small fluctuation. Now, this fluctuation will grow greater and greater as you go towards the back of the supply chain. So small variation on the distribution side ends up being very big on the back side of the supply chain. And this is called the bullwhip effect. Now, obviously you want to, so this gives more emphasis on reducing inventory and managing inventory, because even small variation in inventory could lead to huge variations throughout the supply. So I think at this point we could go ahead and define what supply chain management is. So again, the word collaboration between different supply chain companies, partners. So collaboration and coordination of their activities. So the market demand, and this is very important, it's all driven by the market demand. And we want to meet that market demand efficiently and effectively. That's basically supply chain management. Supply chain management is we want to meet market demand in an efficient way and an effective way. So efficient, we're talking about cost reduction, response, good response, good quality product, and effectively that we do deliver what's expected. So now we'll do an outsourcing example. This is a good chance for you to pause the video whenever we have an example. Pause the video, read the question, try it on your own, and then play the video. So this this is a typical outsourcing example where you have two alternatives. The first alternative is to the school cafeteria to make the pizza on their own. So there's the school cafeteria, they have two choices, whether to make the pizza on their own and sell it, or to order the pizza, and that means outsource it to a pizza palace, and we're gonna compare these two cost scenarios and find and pick the cheapest. So in each one of these cases, we have a variable cost. So there's a variable cost per slice, and there's a cost for using the kitchen, which is a fixed cost, regardless of how many pieces of pizza do we sell. And then for the other scenario where we're ordering from the Pizza Palace, there is $9 per pizza, 8 slices. So the first one they gave us the variable cost in terms of per slice. Now they give us in terms of a whole pizza, so we just have to divide by 8. And then we have the fixed cost. Now the fixed cost of running the kitchen, the cafeteria, I mean the labor cost for the cafeteria is $75 per day. We no longer have kitchen costs. And they're telling us the demand is 200 per day. So we just have to compare these two alternatives. So if we make the pizza ourselves, we're using the variable cost plus the fixed cost, and we get 236. And if we buy, again, variable cost plus the fixed cost, and we get 210. So obviously buying is cheaper. So far we've been talking about the needs within the supply chain management. So what are the needs? And we defined what supply chain management is. Now we go on to talk about the actual operations within the supply chain and strategies. Within the supply chain, we have strategic operations or activity, tactical activities, and operating activities. Designing the supply chain would be something that you would do strategically. And what do we mean by designing a supply chain is deciding which suppliers to pick, which suppliers to deal with, which distributors to deal with, where to locate your plants, which customer groups or which retailers to deal with, and which customer groups to target. All that is on the strategic side. The tactical activities are things like inventory, purchasing, production policies, transportation, logistics. So we've covered some of these aspects already in this class. We talked about inventory policies. We've talked about production. So now in this chapter, we'll be really focusing on logistics in terms of tactical activities. Now, operating activities are things like quality control, production and planning control, which we also covered in this class. So we covered a chapter on inventory. So a whole chapter we covered on inventory. But in terms of supply chain, the question that you might ask is where to keep inventory. Do you keep inventory closer to where the customer is? Or do you keep it closer where production is? Or maybe you let the suppliers keep inventory? Well, whatever you decide, so that question is a bit complex because that depends on what product you're selling, and each product might have different needs. But one thing for sure is you want to hold as much as you can, hold all your inventory in one place rather than in various places. So, and especially when we're talking about safety stock. So try to hold your safety stock in one central location opposed to multiple locations. There's many reasons for this. One reason is cost. It's cheaper to hold inventory in one place rather than various places. And also keeping track of inventory when you have various places is much more complex than if you have one place. Um, Another very important operational insight within the supply chain is something we call postponement, which is also termed as delayed differentiation. So it's also termed as delayed differentiation. And the idea of delayed differentiation is to leave the last touches on the product till the end, towards the end of the supply chain. So the forward part of the supply chain. closer to where the customer is. And the reason for this is if we delay differentiation, then we are closer to the time to market or the selling point of the product. And hence we're closer to the actual consumption of the product. So we know more about the behavior of the consumer and how the consumer is probably going to respond to the product. So we allow differentiation to happen closer to that point rather than way before that point. So if we've done the differentiation way back where at the supplier or at the manufacturing phase, then probably by the time the product reaches the market, the consumer taste might change, which basically puts us in trouble because then we end up with products that don't sell because they've been differentiated long ago before we know what the customer behavior is going to be. So differentiation should be happening towards the closer to where the customer is. Now, a very good example of this is the color of your car. Now, most car manufacturers, they will leave the actual painting or of the car towards the end because then they would have more information about which color is prominent in this season or in this year, and hence they would still have an opportunity to target those customer groups. So now we move on to the most or one of the most important areas within supply chain management, which is logistics. As you mentioned at the beginning of the topic, that most of the things in chapter 11, the supply chain management chapter, are mostly theory, definitions, lists, principles. There's not that many calculation questions until we hit logistics. Logistics is where we're going to see calculation questions, where we're trying to weigh the differences between alternatives, transportation alternatives. So this has been a popular area for questions, final examination question. So let's talk about logistics. And remember, logistics has to do with the movement and storage of material within the supply chain. So there are two different types of logistics that we're going to be talking about. Logistics between facilities and logistics within the facility itself. So logistics between facilities, we could have trains transporting things between supply chain facilities. We could have trucks. There is many different transportation alternative. We could have things moved by airplane. And this is the type of question you're gonna see in COMM 225, where they're gonna give you different transportation alternative, whether it's air or train, and you have to calculate the cost and pick the better transportation alternative. So within each facility, we still have transportation happening, movement of material. So within a warehouse, so if we take the example, a warehouse, so right here, we see in this warehouse there is material moving, there's forklifts moving, taking things from the shelf, moving them to another shelf, sometimes moving them to the point of sale. Now we see this type of layout. Sometimes we see it in the IKEA, the back of the IKEA store, where you see a lot of shelves and the movement of material within the warehouse, whether the IKEA warehouse or any other warehouse, is also a type of logistics. So logistics is not only the movement of things between facilities, but within the facility itself is also considered logistics. So this is an example of logistics moving within a facility, a manufacturing facility, and here we have work centers, and material have to move all through the work center, from receiving to first work center, second, all the way to shipping. So there, and in this case, we have logistics inside the production facility. So for the logistics, the movement of products between facilities, we are going to see options. And each one of these options is going to be good in some things, while it's going to be bad in other things. So for example, an airplane could be very fast, so fast delivery, but it's going to be very expensive, right? While a ship could be cheap to transport things by ship, but it might be very slow. So, and this is what you're going to see in these questions. You're going to have two alternatives. One of them is slower than the other, but cheaper, and you have to make a decision based on some calculations. So for picking the best transportation mode, we're going to be looking at speed versus cost. And the idea is to balance transportation cost with inventory holding costs. So we're going to see now something called inventory holding cost. And inventory holding cost is going to be similar to what we've seen in the inventory chapter, except we only have one formula here. And when things are going to take too long, for example, if you're moving things on a ship, then obviously the inventory holding costs are going to be big because you're holding inventory for a very long time. Opposed to when you're moving things by air, it's going to be shorter, which means less inventory cost. Now, also very important, we will see also safety stock in some of these questions. Now, the questions we're going to do today in this presentation, we're not going to have any safety stock questions, but we will do some questions when we do our final examination review. So far we're not going to be looking at safety stock, but we will take a look at safety stock later in the coming questions. So let's take an example on how to select the transportation mode. So these questions are going to have alternatives. So the idea is they're going to give you alternatives, and you have to pick the cheapest alternative. So here we have two alternatives. So this is an alternative, and this is another alternative, alternative A and B. And then they're giving us a transportation cost for each one of them, and then how long it takes. So transportation cost and how long it takes. And then we have a holding cost, which we will need to figure to get the pipeline inventory or in transit holding costs. So we have two things, the transportation cost and in transit holding cost. Also, when we have safety stock, we'll add a third component, which is the safety stock. So in transit, we have this equation. Remember, since the final examination is going to be open book for you, so make sure you write down all the important equations, and this is one of the important equations. This equation is good when you have an annual H. You're going to multiply it by how long it takes for each for each alternative, and then you're going to divide by 365. So now let's do it for each alternative. So for the first alternative, they're telling us $100, so we write $100, and the holding cost is 700, so we have 700 for both cases. Now the difference, for alternative B, it's $120. Now for alternative A, it is 8 days. It takes 8 days. And for alternative B, it takes 7 days. 7 days here, so it takes 7 days. We're just applying this equation right here, plus our transportation costs, and we're going to get two different costs. And the cheapest of these two costs is going to be alternative A. So we're going to choose alternative A. So very important in logistics in the context of supply chain the very important place where we're going to see a lot of logistics is warehouses. In warehouses, we see a lot of logistics within the warehouse, a lot of movement of material within the facility, and also we'll see a lot of transportation into the warehouse and out of the warehouse. Now we're going to get to very important terminology: consolidation. Let's start with consolidation, which is the case when we have trucks coming maybe from different regions. Let's imagine these trucks are carrying iPads. So iPads, and let's imagine that on each truck you have iPads that are going to location A, then you have an iPad going to location B and then C, and same here. You have some iPads that are going to location A, B, and C, and then you have iPads going location A, B, C. When it comes to consolidation, what we're going to do is we're going to take all the A's, and because they're all going to the same destination, we are going to load them up on this truck and it's going to go to that destination. So that's the point of consolidation. Now, this is very useful. You could think of many examples of this. So it's very useful because when we're shipping things, we usually use the same space or containers to ship to other destinations, or maybe having multi-products in one truck, and then we have to consolidate these into trucks that will go eventually to one destination, or maybe a truck that only carries one product. So now we go on to deconsolidation, which is the vice versa. So here we have one truck coming with maybe one truck is coming from with maybe 3 different products, and then we're gonna so A and B and C. So and we're gonna basically deconsolidate these products into all the products going to A are gonna go into that truck, and then all the P products are gonna go into that truck, and so on. So this is the point of consolidation. So cross-docking in logistics, a lot of companies use something called cross-docking, and cross-docking is a way to actually have shipping and shipping docks, receiving docks, and shipping docks. So what happens is you're going to have trucks coming at the shipping side, and right away they are unloaded and transferred to the trucks that are going to ship out without holding anything on the shelves. So cross-docking is very, very important and cost efficient. For example, Walmart, one reason why Walmart had a huge advantage over other department stores is because they used cross-docking. And by cross-docking, the idea is trucks are going to come into a warehouse, unload, but nothing is going to be held in the warehouse. Right away, things are going to be carried to the other side of the warehouse where you're going to have the outbound traffic, and things are going to leave. So nothing is held in the warehouse. Everything is unloaded and loaded directly without holding anything in the warehouse. And this is very cost effective because you're not holding any inventory in the warehouse. So now we're going to talk about delivery methods between the different parties within the supply chain. Usually we're talking about the front side, the retailers, and the distributor or producers on the back side. So the first system is we have a quick response system, which is just one-way communication from the buyer to the supplier asking for replenishment based on sales. Now, ECR, efficient consumer response, is QAR. It's the same thing as QR, except it's supplemented with another channel for communication from the supplier to the buyer or the retailer. So, for example, a QR system, for example, if a company wants 1,000 units of product A, the supplier cannot answer or respond. It's either the supplier is going to replenish or not. But with an ECR system, the supplier could communicate back saying, well, I don't have this product. Could you, would an alternative product do, or could we do something else? So this gives a two-way communication. So that's ECR. Then we get into vendor managed inventory, which is basically a way for it's a system where the vendor or the supplier manages the inventory. So the vendor keeps the inventory until it's exactly needed, and then it would be delivered to the buyer. So the vendor will manage the inventory, will hold the inventory. So the QR is very common in retail, ECR is common in groceries, and VMI is common in convenience store. Then we get to the distribution request planning, DRP, which is the classical where everything starts with a forecast, and that forecast is communicated back to the later stages in the supply chain, and then the later stage in supply chain will start to production to meet that demand. If you remember, we mentioned at the beginning of the lecture that physical material is always moving forward in the supply chain. Well, there's an exception to that. The exception is that there is sometimes reverse logistics, and this is due to recycling, returns, defectives. So for example, if a product gets to the customer and the customer feels that it's not as he wishes, so the customer might not be happy with the product, then he or she would send the product back, and now the physical movement of material is going this way. So it's against the natural way of flow within the supply chain, and this would be due to reverse logistics. Now, for reverse logistics, we want to make sure that we're doing good gatekeeping, and good gatekeeping is we're screening the goods to prevent incorrect acceptance of goods. So we make sure that we make sure that the materials that is going back in reverse logistics is meant to go back. Now we go on to talk about supply chain technologies. And we're going to start talking about e-commerce. And e-commerce is very important, especially for global supply chains. So it's very important because it will reduce response time, and especially in the case when you have a lot of data, then e-commerce is gonna work out very well. And also having e-commerce means that you're gonna be having a lot of data, a lot of consumer data. And very good example of this is Amazon. Amazon being an e-commerce place, they're able to have a lot of data in terms of sales, in terms of geographic location of where the sales are coming from, times an immense amount of data. Then here we were talking about virtual companies, and virtual companies are companies that don't add any value to the product. They're just companies that rely heavily on the supply chain. So they're not producing anything. So you could think of that as companies in North America that rely heavily on supply chains in East Asia. So they're not adding any value, they're just a label for the product. So sometimes with these virtual companies, you will not even find a physical place for them. They might not have a physical office or physical headquarters. They're just a virtual company based on that is highly dependent on their supply chain. Um, So obviously there are many advantages to e-commerce, reducing paperwork, reducing lead time and inventory, increase accuracy, but also having a lot of data is very, very important because we could use that data to forecast and to sort of figure out what's increasing demand or what's decreasing demand. A very important technology that is in the supply chain is RFID, radio frequency identifier technology. And these, so think of the RFD as a barcode. So it's sort of like a barcode, except it's a very sophisticated barcode. So it's not just your average barcode that you find at a supermarket. It's a sophisticated barcode. And we have two different types of it. We have the passive radio frequency identifier, and this does not emit any frequency. So it works for short range, while we have the active RFID, which emits long range frequency. So what's the use of RFID? Well, sometimes the products company keep are very expensive, and they want to know where they are at any time in storage. So what happens with a lot of products is they're kept in storage at warehouses, and the companies are really interested and keen on knowing where these items are. And so if you are in close range, so if your range is very close, so close range, so the range is very close, then these passive RFID will work just fine, and you will have a device, and the device will be able to pick them up. Now with active RFID, the idea is when the range is very big. So for example, if you have a product being shipped from East Asia and it's somewhere in the Pacific, now obviously a passive RFID will not work. An active RFID will work because that product on a ship somewhere will send a frequency, long range frequency, to you to tell you basically where it is at any point. So this is the difference between active and passive RFID. So what makes an effective, successful supply chain? So what makes a supply chain successful, or what makes a high performing supply chain? It all starts with sharing information. This is the common denominator. So if the most important thing is for all different parties, entities, companies, organization within the supply chain, they need to share information. If they're sharing information, then that's one huge step ahead towards a successful supply chain. Now, here we have 5 different things that are important in to get to a successful supply chain. One of them is trust. We need to have, it's very important to have trust between all the different partners within the supply chain. We see the Japanese model, especially in Japanese car manufacturing, where a lot of the Japanese companies, they have very strong and very credible relationship with their suppliers, and that develops trust, and trust is very important. Effective communication. Communicating things like data, sales data, is very important that people parties at the front of the supply chain. So this part of the supply chain are always sharing data backward. The people in the back of the supply chain, they know what's going on. So they know ahead of time what to expect. Performance metrics. Having some metrics to measure the performance of the supply chain is very important. Supply chain visibility, which basically means that you're able to know who your suppliers are, how your network looks like, and you're able to communicate with anybody at any time. Now, this is easier said than done. In reality, a lot of companies, when if some of you have worked in companies, you probably realize this, that a lot of times you found that some of the contact information for some suppliers are missing, their phone numbers are missing, their coordinates are missing. This is a very bad sign. That means you don't have supply chain visibility. Supply chain visibility is that you could connect with any member of the supply chain at any time. Now the last thing is event management capability. Obviously, we're living through a crisis now with the coronavirus, and this you could think of this as an event in a supply chain. This event probably is going to affect all supply chains because a lot of suppliers probably had to close down. So what happens if your supplier closed down? What are you going to do? Do you have an alternative plan? Do you have alternative supplier? And this is, I mean, the more robust your supply chains, the better you're going to be equipped to deal with events, unseen event. But all these five things, all of them come together in the very important common denominator of sharing information. So again, this chapter, there's a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of definitions. So we have CPFR, collaborative planning, forecasting, and replenishment. All it's saying is basically having a lot of communication, a lot of coordination on forecasts. In supply chains, in operations in general, everything starts with a forecast. We try to forecast demand and we pass that forecast to the backside of the supply chain. So suppliers, people who, companies, organizations that work on the back of the supply chain, getting raw materials and stuff like that, they have the information needed. And with CPFR, the collaboration, so there's always collaboration between the manufacturer and the customer, distributor, about the very important information about how the market is behaving. This is going to be very important in for effective supply chain management. So supply chain metrics. How do we measure the the performance of the supply chain? So we have some score metrics where we're gonna try to have different metrics for reliability, flexibility, expenses, asset utilization. And in this idea is we're gonna identify key indicators for these things. So for example, reliability, on-time delivery. How many times are we delivering on time? If the percentage is high, then we're doing a good thing. Flexibility. How does the supply chain respond to unseen events, changes in demand? That's another. Cost management is going to be very important. How do you use your inventory? Your inventory turnover. How fast is your inventory turning? All these are going to be very, very important in terms of our score model, which is basically we're giving scores to different supply chain attributes. So the last basically subtopic of this chapter is purchasing. And purchasing is important because in a supply chain, every part of the supply chain is purchasing something from another part of the supply chain. So this part of the supply chain is purchasing something from the distributor. The distributor is buying something from warehouses. Warehouses are buying from the manufacturer, manufacturer from supplier, and so on. So everybody is purchasing. So every organization in the supply chain is purchasing from another organization. Now, for those of you who are going to major in supply chain, a lot of the jobs in supply chain management are going to be in purchasing. The goal of purchasing is to get everything that is needed by the company effectively and at a good cost. So we're looking at cost is going to be very important in a purchasing, and this is we're talking now about the purchasing department or the purchasing agent that are working for the company. So cost is going to be important, quality of the purchases, timing of the delivery, and forming of partnerships. Now we go to explain the differences between decentralized and centralized purchasing. Centralized purchasing says is that there is one department within the company that does the purchasing for everybody else in the company, while decentralized purchasing, it means that each department within the company is doing their own purchasing. Now, there's an advantage and disadvantage for each. So in centralized purchasing, the advantage obviously is you got economy of the scale. When all the departments are centralizing their purchasing in one department, that means they could get discount, quantity discount. But obviously, the disadvantage is sometimes departments know better what they really need, and maybe the central department doesn't really know the specifics of what the department needs. So maybe in that case, the decentralized purchasing might be better. If you're working in a purchasing department, then how do you determine the prices? Well, one method that is used often, competitive bidding. So you have more than one competitor bidding for a project or bidding for the sale of something, then you would go for the cheapest. Now, this is not always great, especially when it comes for product, when you need product of high quality. So there, maybe you will need more negotiation. So you're talking about quality, cost, and other things. There are some things where you can't help it. There's already published prices for it. For example, the price of metals, the price of oil, all these things are already decided. So there's no negotiating in these prices. So remember, negotiation is not a win-lose confrontation. It's a win-win confrontation, and it shouldn't be even a confrontation. So everybody should be a winner in any negotiation. So the supplier gets something and the buyer gets something out of it. Value analysis is the idea that we basically start thinking about the product and thinking about parts that go onto the product and thinking about how we could maybe get other parts that could be less costly and maybe better quality also. So spend analysis is basically going back to what you've spent and trying to think about the data, what was bought, from which supplier, what was the total expenditure. And this information is very important for later purchases, because if you know how much you purchased a part last year, then you have some information when you want to negotiate for with a different supplier or a new supplier. So whenever there's money, there's going to be a lot of issues when it comes to ethics. So consider the interest of the organization, not your own interests. If you're a purchasing agent or you work for a purchasing department, so it's very important to think of the organization. If you're doing a bidding process, it has to be fair, it has to be transparent. Again, with this chapter, again, there's a lot of terminology. I suggest that you read the chapter on your own, and given that the final examination will be open books, so you have access to this. So it might be a good idea to use what the lecture I'm doing right now to basically take good notes, and these notes are going to work as your basis for maybe you have them next to you when you want to do the exam. So just as we talked a lot about negotiation, about costs, and about what's purchasing, but a very important aspect of a purchasing agent's job or purchasing department job is the choosing of suppliers. And we mentioned we choose the supplier that has the best metrics in terms of reliability, cost, quality, and other factors. Maybe certification is important. So maybe the supplier is certified. We've seen on the quality chapter that if a supplier is ISO certified, that signals to the buyer that this company is serious about quality, for example. Develop good supplier relationships, so long-term relationships, develop trust, develop partnership are going to be very important within purchasing. So finally, how do we choose a supplier? Quality is important. How flexible is the supplier is important. The location of the supplier is important. Remember, if the supplier is located in a far place, that means the transportation cost is going to be high. Price is going to be important. Also, reputation and stability of that supplier. Lead time, how long does the supplier respond to respond? Does the supplier take a long time to respond? All that is going to play a factor in choosing the supplier. What do other customers say about the supplier? This is also important. Services and after sale are also going to be very, very important. So that basically concludes our this presentation on supply chain management. You could also read the chapter. I suggest that you read the chapter. There's a lot, like I said, there's a lot of terminology. I've included in this presentation a lot of the terminology in the book. So a lot of the things you'll probably, if you go read the book, you remember them from the presentation. So good luck and meet you in the next presentation.